The week had been long and tiring, filled with endless tasks and responsibilities, so when the man finally stepped into his villa, he allowed himself to breathe in the comfort of silence. The house stood quietly at the edge of the neighborhood, surrounded by soft greenery and tall walls that usually gave him a sense of safety. He settled into a chair by the wide glass doors, sipping a cup of tea, enjoying the calm rhythm of the evening, and letting his thoughts drift away from the noise of work. The golden rays of the setting sun painted the walls with warmth, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly still. Yet, what he did not know was that his peaceful retreat was being quietly interrupted. From a nearby window in the house next door, someone's eyes lingered on him, filled not with friendliness, but with suspicion. The neighbor, who had seen him entering and leaving at different times during the week, began to convince themselves that something about this man was unusual. To the man, the world seemed free of worry. He thought he was alone, enjoying the comfort of his own home, but in reality, his every movement was being noted. A shadow of doubt had already formed in another person's mind, and though no words were exchanged, the air was thick with unspoken tension. The man stretched his arms, unaware of the watchful gaze fixed upon him, unaware that his peaceful evening was about to be disrupted by actions he could not foresee. What he believed to be just another quiet night at his villa was slowly turning into the beginning of a story that would shake not only his own sense of calm, but also the trust within the neighborhood. From the other side of the fence, the neighbor kept watching, their eyes narrowing each time the man walked in or out of the villa. At first it was just a passing glance, the kind anyone gives when they see movement next door. But slowly those glances turned into long, sharp looks filled with doubt. The neighbor could not remember ever seeing the man before, and the thought began to grow like a seed. What if he did not belong there? They replayed moments in their mind. The man arriving late in the evening, stepping out early in the morning, sometimes carrying a bag, sometimes walking with a calm expression as if he owned the place. None of this seemed normal to the neighbor, though in truth, it was only their imagination twisting simple acts into something suspicious. They began to wonder why no one else in the neighborhood had mentioned him, and this silence only fueled their doubts further. Instead of knocking on the door and asking directly, the neighbor chose to stand back and assume the worst. Every light that flickered on inside the villa seemed like a signal. Every sound of a door closing echoed louder in their mind, until what had once been nothing more than harmless curiosity became a heavy suspicion. The neighbor convinced themselves that something was wrong, that maybe the villa had been taken over by someone who had no right to be there. The more they thought about it, the more certain they became, and the stillness of the evening only deepened their unease. To them, it was no longer a quiet man enjoying his home. It was a stranger whose presence demanded answers. And soon, those doubts would drive the neighbor to take a step that would change everything. The neighbor paced back and forth inside their house, unable to let go of the thoughts swirling in their mind. Every sound from the villa seemed to confirm their fears. Every movement of the man appeared suspicious, and soon the weight of doubt felt too heavy to ignore. Their eyes kept drifting to the phone on the table, and after a long moment of hesitation, they finally picked it up. Without considering the possibility of being wrong, the neighbor dialed the local police and reported what they believed to be a strange man occupying the villa. Their voice carried both urgency and certainty, as if they were doing the neighborhood a favor by raising the alarm. The operator on the other end listened carefully, asked a few quick questions, and assured the caller that officers would be sent to investigate. Hanging up the phone, the neighbor felt a strange mix of satisfaction and nervousness, convinced that they had acted responsibly. Outside, the villa remained calm, the man inside unaware of the storm being set into motion against him. He continued his quiet evening, while only a few houses away. Flashing lights were being prepared, engines were starting, and officers were being briefed on what they thought was a possible intruder. The neighbor, watching from behind their curtains, felt their heart beat faster. imagining the moment when the truth would come out and they would be proven right. They did not think about the man's feelings, nor the damage that suspicion alone could cause. They only believed they had taken the correct step. What seemed like a simple phone call was about to turn into an event that would draw the attention of the entire street, and change how everyone saw both the man and the neighbor forever. The street, which had been quiet only moments before, suddenly filled with the low hum of engines and the sharp flash of red and blue lights. 2 police cars rolled to a stop in front of the villa, their tires crunching against the gravel. Doors opened quickly, and uniformed officers stepped out with steady, practiced movements, their expressions serious and their hands resting near their belts. They had been told about a possible intruder, and every detail of their training pushed them to treat the situation with caution. The neighbor, hidden behind a curtain, watched with eager eyes, believing that their suspicions were about to be proven true. Inside the villa, however, the man sat peacefully in his living room, unaware of the scene unfolding just beyond his walls. He had no idea that strangers were about to knock on his door and question his right to sit in his own home. The officers walked toward the entrance with firm steps, scanning the quiet house, their boots echoing on the pavement. The air grew heavy with tension, as though the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. The man turned a page of his book, sipping his tea in silence, still untouched by the storm outside. Then came the sound, 3 hard knocks against the wooden door, breaking the calm of the evening. It was not the knock of a friendly visitor, but the commanding knock of authority. The man frowned slightly, setting his cup aside, his mind already wondering who could be calling so forcefully at this hour. He stood and moved toward the door, each step carrying him closer to the unexpected confrontation waiting on the other side. The peaceful night was over, and without knowing it, he was about to face questions he had never imagined in his own home. The sudden knock echoed through the villa like a drumbeat, firm and demanding, cutting through the calm that had filled the man's evening only moments before. He froze for a second, startled by the sharpness of the sound, then placed his book on the table and slowly walked toward the door. His mind raced with small questions: who could be visiting at this hour, and why with such force? As he reached the entrance, he noticed the faint glow of flashing lights spilling in through the windows, painting streaks of red and blue across the walls. His hand hesitated for a moment on the handle before he finally pulled the door open. There, standing in a row, were uniformed police officers, their expressions serious and watchful. Their presence carried the weight of authority, and their eyes studied him with careful precision, as though every movement he made was being measured. One of the officers stepped forward and spoke firmly, asking him for identification. The man's brows furrowed in confusion. He looked from one face to the other, realizing this was no casual visit, but an official check, one born of suspicion rather than concern. Behind the officers, he noticed the faint shadow of his neighbor peeking through the curtains, watching as if waiting for a show to unfold. The man's heart sank slightly, not because he had anything to hide, but because of the insult hidden within the request. Why should he need to prove he belonged in his own home? Still, he kept his composure, meeting their gaze with calm eyes. Without argument, he nodded, stepping aside to allow them room as he reached for the documents that would confirm his identity. The night had turned from peaceful to tense, and though he remained steady, he knew this encounter was only the beginning of something deeper. The man took a slow breath, steadying himself as the officer stood waiting for his response. Inside, his heart felt heavy, weighed down by the unfairness of being questioned in the very place he called home. Yet on the surface, he remained calm, determined not to show frustration or anger that could make the situation worse. With a polite tone, he stepped back and gestured for the officers to come inside. The living room, still warm with the soft glow of a lamp, felt different now, like a stage where every detail of his life was under inspection. The officers entered cautiously, their eyes scanning the neat space, as though searching for something out of place. The man moved slowly, careful not to appear defensive, though his mind was racing with questions. Why was this happening? What had he done to deserve suspicion? He thought of how peacefully his evening had started, and how quickly it had turned into an interrogation. Despite the knot in his chest, he spoke with respect, asking what had led them to his door. His voice carried no anger, only a quiet confusion that lingered in the air. One of the officers explained they had received a call about a strange man at the villa. Words that stung even though he kept his expression neutral. The man nodded, though deep down the phrase replayed in his mind like an echo. He felt the walls of his own home closing in, as if he were a guest rather than the owner. Still, he chose dignity over confrontation, handing over his identification calmly, showing them around without resistance. He hoped that his composure would speak louder than any accusation. Yet, even as he cooperated, a shadow of disappointment grew inside him, because trust had been broken before it had even begun. The officers settled into the living room, their notebooks ready, their eyes fixed on the man, as though he were a puzzle they had to solve. Their questions came one after another, steady and sharp. Who are you? Why are you here? Do you have proof that this villa belongs to you? The man listened carefully, his face calm, though inside his heart felt a mix of frustration and disbelief. He answered politely, giving his full name, explaining that he had been living there peacefully, and showing them documents that proved ownership. Still, the tone of the questions carried doubt, as if his words alone were not enough. Outside the window, the neighbor stood with arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with an air of self-righteousness, as though expecting to be proven correct. The man caught sight of the neighbor's stern face and felt a sting of betrayal, wondering how simple curiosity had turned into suspicion strong enough to summon police. The officers compared his answers with the papers he handed them, flipping through pages and nodding but still circling back with more questions, as though trying to find a hole in his story. The atmosphere grew heavier, the quiet of his once peaceful home now filled with the sound of pens scratching against paper and the low murmur of official voices. Though he had nothing to hide, he felt the weight of being treated as if he did. Every response he gave was steady, but deep inside, he could not ignore the ache of being doubted in a place that was his safe haven. The neighbor, still outside, shifted slightly, perhaps beginning to wonder if their assumption had been wrong, but pride kept their arms crossed tightly. The man remained patient, silently hoping the truth would speak louder than suspicion. The man reached for a folder he had kept neatly in the drawer of his living room table, pulling out papers that carried proof of his belonging. One by one, he placed them in the officer's hands, official documents with his name printed clearly, electricity and water bills with the villa's address, and even photographs of birthdays and family gatherings held within those very walls. The officers examined each item carefully, holding the pages under the light, reading every detail, and pausing at the photos that spoke of memories no stranger could have faked. The images showed laughter around a dining table, decorations strung across the living room, and moments of joy that only a true resident would know. Despite the growing evidence, the neighbor, standing at the doorway, leaned in and whispered doubts to one of the officers, shaking their head as if to insist something was still wrong. The man noticed, but chose not to argue. Instead, he let the truth speak for itself. His calmness contrasted sharply with the restless suspicion that lingered in the air. The officers exchanged looks, their expressions beginning to soften as the weight of proof piled before them. Still, a layer of tension remained, for the whisper of doubt had not fully faded. The man sat quietly, his hands resting on his knees, his patience unbroken, though his heart was heavy with the sting of mistrust. He wondered how much proof it would take for the world to simply believe him at his word. Outside, the sky darkened slowly, and the villa that once felt like his sanctuary now stood as the stage of suspicion. Yet, through it all, he remained steady, knowing that truth had a way of shining even through the darkest shadows of doubt. The room was thick with tension, every eye fixed on the man as if he were holding the answer to a puzzle no one could solve. He had shown papers, bills, and photographs, yet doubt still lingered, floating quietly in the air like a shadow no one wanted to admit. The officers, polite but cautious, flipped through the documents again, their brows furrowed as if seeking a single missing proof. The neighbor remained just outside the doorway, arms crossed, whispering quiet uncertainties to anyone who would listen, convinced that something about the man did not add up. The man, feeling the weight of suspicion pressing down, remained calm, his movements slow and deliberate. Then, with a steady hand, he reached into his bag, pulling out an item that would leave no room for doubt. He held it up carefully, and the gleam of the official badge caught the dim light of the living room. In that instant, the entire atmosphere shifted. The officers' expressions changed immediately. Their guarded faces softened, eyes widening with recognition, mouths parting slightly as respect replaced suspicion. They straightened their posture, and the questions that had hung in the air disappeared as if they had never existed. Even the neighbor, who had been so sure of wrongdoing, froze, their whispered doubts vanishing into the stillness of the moment. The badge spoke louder than any argument, louder than any document or photo. It carried authority, truth, and undeniable proof of identity. The man's calm demeanor, combined with this single emblem of responsibility, transformed the scene entirely. What had started as suspicion now gave way to acknowledgement, and the power of perception, the assumptions made without knowing the full story, was laid bare for everyone to see. In that room, silence fell, not heavy and tense anymore, but reverent, as the truth finally stood unshaken. The room fell into a sudden, heavy silence, the kind that made every small sound, the ticking of a clock, the rustle of papers stand out sharply. The neighbor, who had been so certain in their suspicion, now felt a wave of shock wash over them. Their face, once filled with pride and self-righteous certainty, drained of color, leaving behind a pale expression that mirrored disbelief and embarrassment. All the whispered doubts and assumptions they had carried so confidently now seemed trivial, even foolish. The truth had revealed itself in the form of a single badge, yet its weight was undeniable. The man standing calmly before them was not merely the owner of the villa, a title that could have been questioned or proven with papers alone, but something far more significant, an FBI agent whose authority and credibility could not be disputed. The officers who had questioned him now relaxed visibly, their previous caution replaced by professional respect and recognition. The air itself seemed to shift, no longer filled with tension or accusation, but with the quiet acknowledgement of reality. The neighbor took a small step back, unsure where to look, feeling the sting of having acted on assumptions rather than facts. Even the man remained calm, his composure unwavering, showing no anger at the neighbor's suspicion, only the quiet patience of someone who knew the truth would eventually emerge. Around them, the living room, once tense with questioning, now felt like a stage for revelation. Each person present absorbed the moment in their own way, recognizing how quickly judgment could turn into embarrassment when faced with undeniable truth. The scene was a lesson unfolding in real time. Appearances and assumptions could be misleading, and respect often depended on understanding rather than suspicion. In that suspended silence, the reality was clear. The man's identity was no longer in doubt, and the lesson had been delivered with quiet authority. The officers stood quietly for a moment, the tension that had filled the room slowly fading as the truth settled in. Then, one of them took a careful step forward, lowering his voice in a tone that was respectful and sincere. "We apologize," he said, his eyes meeting the man's calmly, conveying genuine regret for the misunderstanding. "We were only following protocol after receiving a call about a possible intruder. We had no reason to doubt you personally, and we are truly sorry for any offense caused." The words hung in the air, softening the atmosphere, yet carrying the weight of acknowledgement for what had just happened. The other officers nodded in agreement, their postures relaxing, showing that their previous caution was replaced by respect. The man listened quietly, his calm demeanor unchanged, though inside he felt a mixture of relief and lingering disappointment at being doubted in his own home. The neighbor, who had watched every moment unfold from the doorway, felt the sting of shame creeping into their chest, realizing that their suspicion had set this entire chain of events into motion. The apology was more than just words. It was a recognition that assumptions, even when made with good intentions, could lead to unnecessary tension and embarrassment. The officers explained patiently, giving context to their actions, noting that they were simply doing their duty to investigate a report, and it had never been personal. The man nodded politely, accepting their explanation, understanding that mistakes and misjudgments happen, yet feeling the quiet satisfaction of truth finally being acknowledged. The air, which had been thick with doubt, fear, and tension, now felt lighter, as if the room itself had exhaled. In that moment, a clear lesson was visible to everyone present. Authority and protocol have their place, but human understanding, patience, and acknowledgement are just as important in maintaining trust and respect. The neighbor stood quietly near the doorway, their arms still crossed, but the firmness in their posture had softened. For the first time, they looked down, unable to meet the man's calm gaze. A wave of shame washed over them, creeping up from their chest and filling their mind with regret. They remembered all the assumptions they had made, how quickly they had decided that the man did not belong, how every glance had turned into a whisper of suspicion, and how their doubts had led them to call the police without even asking a simple question. The realization hit hard. Their actions had caused embarrassment not only to the man, but also to the officers who had merely followed protocol. The villa, once just another quiet home in the neighborhood, had become a stage where pride and judgment clashed with truth. Now, faced with undeniable reality, the neighbor could see the full impact of their hasty decisions. They felt the sting of having misjudged someone who had done nothing wrong, and the weight of how easily doubt could escalate into conflict. The air around them seemed heavier, not with tension anymore, but with the uncomfortable awareness of personal error. Even the officers, who had regained their composure after the revelation, exchanged knowing glances, silently acknowledging how quickly perceptions can mislead. The man himself remained composed, showing no anger. Yet the neighbor could feel the quiet dignity in his presence, a reminder of the respect they had failed to extend initially. With each passing second, the neighbor's embarrassment deepened, but so did their understanding. They realized that suspicion without understanding could harm relationships, that quick judgments could hurt innocent people, and that humility was the first step toward learning a valuable lesson. In that moment, the neighbor understood the power of truth and the consequences of letting doubt overshadow empathy. The room was quiet, the tension from the earlier confrontation slowly fading. Yet the weight of the evening's events still lingered in the air. The neighbor's eyes remained lowered, ashamed of their earlier assumptions, and even the officers seemed to pause, reflecting on how quickly doubt had escalated into action. The man, standing calmly in the center of the room, observed them all with quiet composure. He did not raise his voice, nor did he scold or express anger. Instead, he chose his words with care, speaking in a soft tone that carried more power than any shout could. Respect should not depend on a badge, it should depend on trust, he said. His eyes steady, looking at the neighbor, the officers, and the space between them. The simplicity of the statement struck everyone, making them pause and consider the meaning behind it. In that single sentence, he reminded them that authority alone does not create respect, that papers and badges are symbols. But real acknowledgement comes from belief in one another, from trust and understanding. The neighbor felt the weight of their earlier judgment more deeply than before, realizing that their assumptions had broken a trust that could have been simple and mutual. Even the officers reflected silently, understanding that procedures and protocols, though necessary, cannot replace human empathy and fairness. The calmness in the man's voice made the lesson unforgettable. It was not the badge that commanded respect, but the way he carried himself, with dignity and patience. A hush settled over the room as the words sank in, touching hearts quietly but profoundly. Everyone present began to see beyond their immediate assumptions, recognizing that true respect is earned through integrity, honesty, and trust, not demanded by authority. In that moment, the lesson became more than a statement. It became a reflection that would linger in their minds long after the night ended. The words the man had spoken lingered in the air, quiet yet powerful, slowly sinking into the hearts of everyone present. The neighbor, still standing by the doorway, felt the truth of those words pressing down on them, making them realize how their quick judgment had clouded their ability to see clearly. Every whisper of suspicion they had entertained, every glance filled with doubt, now seemed small and foolish compared to the reality before them. The officers, too, reflected on the lesson, understanding that even their trained protocols and careful procedures could never replace the human element of discernment and empathy. They had acted professionally, following the call they received. Yet the calm authority and dignity of the man before them reminded them that respect is earned, not assumed, and that assumptions can often lead to embarrassment, hurt, or misunderstanding. Even a few neighbors who had watched from a distance absorbed the weight of the situation, feeling the subtle power of the truth that had unfolded so simply yet so profoundly. In that quiet living room, the lesson was not loud or dramatic. It was gentle, like a ripple spreading across still water, touching everyone without forcing itself upon them. They all began to see how easily suspicion and judgment could blind respect, how quickly assumptions could escalate into actions with consequences that might never have been intended. The man remained calm, his presence a living example of patience, integrity, and trustworthiness, showing that dignity is not just in words, but in behavior. That evening, the neighbor and officers alike understood that their actions and judgments had a real impact on others, and that trust should never be replaced by doubt without reason. It was a moment of learning, reflection, and quiet transformation for everyone, leaving a memory that would remind them how respect, understanding, and patience are far stronger than suspicion or prejudice. From that day forward, the story of what had happened at the villa began to quietly travel through the neighborhood, whispered from one house to another, yet leaving a lasting impression on everyone who heard it. People remembered the tension of that evening, the flashing lights, and the weight of suspicion that had once clouded the streets. And they also remembered how it had all been transformed by a single truth: the man's calm demeanor, his patience, and the quiet power of his words had revealed something far greater than authority alone, something that could not be measured by papers, documents, or even an official badge. Neighbors began to reflect on their own assumptions, realizing how easily they, too, could judge someone without understanding the full story. The lesson was simple, but profound. Dignity and respect are not granted by position or title. They are earned through recognizing the humanity in others. Even those who had initially felt sure of themselves, including the neighbor who had made the call, could not ignore the deep truth embedded in that night's events. Over time, the tale became a reference point for discussions about fairness, patience, and empathy, a reminder that rushing to judgment could harm relationships and communities. Parents used the story to teach children about the importance of trust and understanding, and casual conversations often turned to reflections on how easily fear and doubt can mislead. The villa itself, once just another home, now symbolized a broader lesson that recognition of human worth comes first, and only after that does authority or proof have meaning. It was a story of suspense, of misjudgment, and ultimately of redemption, leaving behind a neighborhood forever changed, more thoughtful, and more cautious, before letting assumptions overshadow kindness. And as the sun set each evening, those who knew the story remembered that true respect begins with seeing others as human, not as strangers to be questioned or doubted.